Day the sixth. The Introduction. Endeth here the fifth day of the Decameron, beginneth the sixth, wherein, under the rule of Elisa, discourse is had of such as by some sprightly sally have repulsed an attack, or by some ready retort or device have avoided loss, peril, or scorn. Still in mid-heaven the moon had lost her radiance, nor was any part of our world unillumined by the fresh splendour of the dawn, when the Queen being risen and having mustered her company, they hied them, gently sauntering across the dewy mead some distance from the beautiful hill, conversing now of this, now of the other matter, canvassing the stories, their greater or less degree of beauty, and laughing afresh at divers of their incidents, until, the sun being now in his higher ascendant, they began to feel his heat, and turning back by common consent, retraced their steps to the palace, where the tables being already set, and fragrant herbs and fair flowers strewn all about, they, by the Queen's command, before it should grow hotter, addressed themselves to their meal. So having blithely breakfasted, they first of all sang some dainty and jocund ditties, and then, as they were severally minded, composed them to sleep or set them down to chess or dice, while Dioneo and Lauretta fell a singing of Troilus and Cressida. The hour of session being come, they took their places, at the Queen's summons, in their wonted order by the fountain. But when the Queen was about to call for the first story, that happened which had not happened before, to wit, there being a greater uproar in the kitchen among the maids and men, the sound thereof reached the ears of the Queen and all the company. Whereupon the Queen called the seneschal and asked him who bawled so loud, and what was the occasion of the uproar. The seneschal made answer that it was some contention between Lyciska and Tindaro, but the occasion he knew not, having but just come to quiet them, when he received her summons. The Queen then bade him cause Lyciska and Tindaro to come thither forthwith. So they came, and the Queen inquired of them the cause of the uproar. Tindaro was about to make answer, when Lyciska, who was somewhat advanced in years and disposed to give herself airs, and heated to the strife of words, turned to Tindaro and scowling upon him said, "Unmannerly varlet, that makest bold to speak before me, leave me to tell the story." Then turning to the Queen she said, "Madam, this fellow would fain instruct me as to Sycophante's wife, and neither more or less, as if I had not known her well, would have me believe that, the first night that Sycophante lay with her, it was by force and not without effusion of blood that Master Yard made his way into Dusky Hill, which I deny, averring that he met with no resistance, but on the contrary, with a hearty welcome on the part of the garrison. And such a numbskull is he as fondly to believe that the girls are so simple as to let slip their opportunities, while they wait on the caprice of father or brothers, who 6 times out of 7 delay to marry them for 3 or 4 years after they should. Ay, indeed, doubtless they were well advised to tarry so long. Christ's face, I should know the truth of what I swear. There is never a woman in my neighbourhood whose husband had her virginity, and well I know how many and what manner of tricks our married dames play their husbands, and Eustace Booby would fain teach me to know woman as if I were but born yesterday." While Lyciska thus spoke, the ladies laughed, till all their teeth were ready to start from their heads. 6 times at least the Queen bade her be silent, but all in vain. She halted not till she had said all that she had a mind to. When she had done, the Queen turned with a smile to Dioneo, saying, "This is a question for thee to deal with, Dioneo, so hold thyself in readiness to give final judgment upon it when our stories are ended." "Madam," replied Dioneo forthwith, "I give judgment without more ado. I say that Lyciska is in the right. I believe that it is even as she says, and that Tindaro is a fool." Whereupon Lyciska burst out laughing, and turning to Tindaro, "Now did I not tell thee so?" quoth she. "Begone, in God's name. Dost think to know more than I, thou that art but a sucking babe? Thank God, I have not lived for nothing. Not I." And had not the queen sternly bade her be silent, and make no more disturbance, unless she had a mind to be whipped, and sent both her and Tindaro back to the kitchen, the whole day would have been spent in naught but listening to her. So Lekiska and Tindaro having withdrawn, the queen charged Philomena to tell the first story, and gaily thus Philomena began. End of Day 6, the Introduction.
Day 6, the First Story. A knight offers to carry Madonna Oretta a horseback with a story, but tells it so ill that she prays him to dismount her. As stars are set for an ornament in the serene expanse of heaven, and likewise in springtime flowers and leafy shrubs in the green meadows, so damsels in the hour of rare and excellent discourse is wit with its bright sallies, which, being brief, are much more proper for ladies than for men, seeing that prolixity of speech, where brevity is possible, is much less allowable to them. But for whatever cause, be it the sorry quality of our understanding, or some especial enmity that heaven bears to our generation, few ladies or none are left to-day that when occasion prompts are able to meet it with apt speech, or if aught of the kind they hear, can understand it aright. To our common shame be it spoken. But as, touching this matter, enough has already been said by Pampinea, I purpose not to enlarge thereon, but, that you may know that excellence resides in speech apt for the occasion, I am minded to tell you after how courteous a fashion a lady imposed silence upon a gentleman. 'Tis no long time since there dwelt in our city a lady, noble, debonair, and of excellent discourse, whom not a few of you may have seen or heard of, whose name, for such high qualities merit not oblivion, was Madonna Oretta, her husband being Messer Geri Spina. Now this lady, happening to be, as we are, in the country, moving from place to place for pleasure with a company of ladies and gentlemen, whom she had entertained the day before at breakfast at her house, and the place of their next sojourn, whither they were to go afoot, being some considerable distance off, one of the gentlemen of the company said to her, Madonna Oretta, so please you, I will carry you great part of the way a horseback with one of the finest stories in the world. Indeed, sir, replied the lady, I pray you do so, and I shall deem it the greatest of favours. Whereupon the gentleman, who perhaps was no better master of his weapon than of his story, began a tale, which in itself was indeed excellent, but which, by repeating the same word 3, 4, or 6 times, and now and again harking back, saying, I say not well, and erring not seldom in the names, setting one in place of another, he utterly spoiled, besides which his mode of delivery accorded very ill with the character of the persons and incidents, insomuch that Madonna Oretta, as she listened, did oft sweat, and was like to faint, as if she were ill, and at the point of death, and being at length able to bear no more of it, witting that the gentleman had got into a mess, and was not like to get out of it, she said pleasantly to him, Sir, this horse of yours trots too hard, I pray you be pleased to set me down. The gentleman, being perchance more quick of apprehension than he was skilful in narration, missed not the meaning of her sally, and took it in all good and gay humour. So, leaving unfinished the tale which he had begun, and so mishanded, he addressed himself to tell her other stories. End of Day 6, the First Story.
Day 6, the Second Story. Sisti, a baker, by an apt speech gives Messer Geri Spina to know that he has by inadvertence asked that of him which he should not.
All the ladies and the men alike, having greatly commended Madonna Oretta's apt saying, the queen bade Pampinea follow suit, and thus she began.
Fair ladies, I cannot myself determine whether nature or fortune be the more at fault. the one in furnishing a noble soul with a vile body, or the other in allotting a base occupation to a body endowed with a noble soul, whereof we may have seen an example among others in our fellow citizen Sisti, whom, furnished though he was with a most lofty soul, Fortune made a baker. And verily I should curse nature and fortune alike, did I not know that nature is most discreet, and that fortune, albeit the foolish imagine her blind, has 1,000 eyes. For it is, I suppose, that, being wise above a little, they do as mortals ofttimes do, who, being uncertain as to their future, provide against contingencies by burying their most precious treasures in the basest places in their houses, as being the least likely to be suspected, whence in the hour of their greatest need they bring them forth, the base place having kept them more safe than the dainty chamber would have done. And so these two arbitresses of the world would seldom hide their most precious commodities in the obscurity of their crafts that are reputed most base, that thence being brought to light they may shine with a brighter splendour. Whereof how in a trifling matter Sisti, the baker, gave proof, restoring the eyes of the mind to Messer Jerry Spina, whom the story of his wife, Madonna Oretta, has brought to my recollection. I am minded to show you in a narrative which shall be of the briefest. I say then that Pope Boniface, with whom Messer Jerry Spina stood very high in favour and honour, having sent drivers of his courtiers to Florence as ambassadors to treat of certain matters of great moment, and they being lodged in Messer Jerry's house, where he treats with them of the said affairs of the Pope, 'twas for some reason or other the wont of Messer Jerry and the ambassadors of the Pope to pass almost every morning by Santa Maria Ugi, where Sisti the baker had his bakehouse, and plied his craft in person. Now, albeit Fortune had allotted him a very humble occupation, she had nevertheless prospered him therein to such a degree that he was grown most wealthy, and without ever aspiring to change it for another, lived in most magnificent style, having among his other good things a cellar of the best wines, white and red, that were to be found in Florence or the country parts. And marking Messer Jerry and the ambassadors of the Pope pass every morning by his door, he bethought him that, as 'twas very hot, 'twould be a very courteous thing to give them to drink of his good wine. But comparing his rank with that of Messer Jerry, he deemed it unseemly to presume to invite him, and cast about how he might lead Messer Jerry to invite himself. So, wearing always the whitest of doublets, and a spotless apron, he denoted rather the miller than the baker. He let bring every morning about the hour that he expected Messer Jerry and the ambassadors to pass by his door, a spick and span bucket of fresh and cool spring water, and a small Bolognese flagon of his good white wine, and 2 beakers that shone like silver, so bright were they. And there down he sat him, as they came by, and after hawking once or twice, fell a-drinking his wine with such gusto that 'twould have raised a thirst in a corpse. Which Messer Jerry, having observed on 2 successive mornings, said on the 3rd, "What is it, Sisti? Isn't it good?" Whereupon Sisti jumped up and answered, "Ay, sir, good it is, but in what degree I might no means make you understand unless you tasted it." Mr. Jerry, in whom either the heat of the weather or unwonted fatigue, or perchance the gusto with which he had seen Sisti drink, had bred a thirst, turned to the ambassadors and said with a smile, "Gentlemen, 'twere well to test the quality of this worthy man's wine. It may be such that we shall not repent us." And so, in a body, they came up to see where Sisti stood, who, having caused a goodly bench to the beakers, said, "Stand back, comrades, and leave this office to me, for I know as well how to serve wine as to bake bread, and expect not to taste a drop yourselves." Which said, he washed 4 fine new beakers with his own hands, and having sent for a small flagon of his good wine, he heedfully filled the beakers and presented them to Messer Jerry and his companions, who deemed the wine the best that they had drunk for a good while. So Messer Jerry, having praised the wine not a little, came there to drink every morning with the ambassadors as long as they tarried with him. Now, when the ambassadors had received their congé and were about to depart, Messer Jerry gave a grand banquet, to which he bade some of the most honourable of the citizens, and also Sisti, who could by no means be induced to come. However, Messer Jerry bade one of his servants go fetch a flask of Sisti's wine, and serve half a beaker thereof to each guest at the first course. The servant, somewhat offended perhaps that he had not been suffered to taste any of the wine, took with him a large flask, which Sisti no sooner saw than, "Son," quoth he, "Messer Jerry does not send thee to me." And often as the servant affirmed that he did, he could get no other answer, wherewith he was fain at last to return to Messer Jerry. "Go, get thee back," said Messer Jerry, "and tell him that I do send thee to him, and if he answers thee so again, ask him to whom I send thee." So the servant came back and said, "Sisti, Messer Jerry does for sure send me to thee." "Son," answered Sisti, "Messer Jerry does for sure not send thee to me." "To whom then," said the servant, "does he send me?" "To Arno," returned Sisti. Which being reported by the servant to Messer Jerry, the eyes of his mind were straightway opened, and, "Let me see," quoth he to the servant, "what flask it is thou takest there." And when he had seen it, "Sisti says sooth," he added, and having sharply chidden him, he caused him take with him a suitable flask, which when Sisti saw, "Now know I," quoth he, "that 'tis indeed Messer Jerry that sends thee to me," and blithely filled it. And having replenished the rundlet that same day with wine of the same quality, he had it carried with due care to Messer Jerry's house, and followed after himself, where finding Messer Jerry, he said, "I would not have you think, sir, that I was appalled by the great flask your servant brought me this morning. 'Twas but that I thought you had forgotten that which by my little beakers I gave you to understand, when you were with me of late, to wit, that this is no table wine, and so wished this morning to refresh your memory. Now, however, being minded to keep the wine no longer, I have sent you all I have of it to be henceforth entirely at your disposal. Mr. Jerry set great store by Sisty's gift, and thanked him accordingly, and ever made much of him, and entreated him as his friend. End of Day 6, the Second Story.
Day 6, the Third Story. Monna nonne de Pulci, by a ready retort, silences the scarce seemly jesting of the Bishop of Florence.
Pampinia's story ended, and praise not a little bestowed on Cisti, alike for his apt speech and for his handsome present, the Queen was pleased to call forthwith for a story from Lauretta, who blithely thus began.
Debonair, my ladies, the excellency of wit, and our lack thereof, have been noted with no small truth, first by Pampinea, and after her by Philomena, to which topic 'twere bootless to return. Wherefore, to that which has been said touching the nature of wit, I purpose but to add one word, to remind you that its bite should be as a sheep's bite, and not as a dog's. For if it bite like a dog, 'tis no longer wit, but discourtesy. With which maxim the words of Madonna Oretta and the apt reply of Cisti accorded excellently. True indeed it is that if 'tis by way of retort, and one that has received a dog's bite gives the biter a like bite in return, it does not seem to be reprehensible, as otherwise it would have been. Wherefore one must consider how and when and on whom, and likewise where, one exercises one's wit. By ill observing which matters, one of our prelates did once upon a time receive no less shrewd a bite than he gave, as I will show you in a short story. While Messer Antonio d'Orso, a prelate both worthy and wise, was Bishop of Florence, there came thither a Catalan gentleman, Messer Dego de la Ratta by name, being King Ruberto's marshal. Now, Dego being very goodly of person and inordinately fond of women, it so befell that of the ladies of Florence, she that he regarded with especial favour was the very beautiful niece of a brother of the said bishop. And having learned that her husband, though of a good family, was but a caitiff and avaricious in the last degree, he struck a bargain with him, that he should lie one night with the lady for 500 florins of gold. Whereupon he had the same number of popolins of silver, which were then current, gilded, and having lain with the lady, albeit against her will, gave them to her husband. Which coming to be generally known, the caitiff husband was left with the loss and the laugh against him, and the bishop, like a wise man, feigned to know naught of the affair. And so the bishop and the marshal being much together, it befell that on St. John's Day, as they rode side by side down the street whence they start to run the Palio, and took note of the ladies, the bishop espied a young gentlewoman, whom this present pestilence has reft from us, Monna Nonna de Pulci by name, a cousin of Messer Alesso Rinucci, whom you must all know. Whom, for that she was lusty and fair, and of excellent discourse and good courage, and but just settled with her husband in Porta San Piero, the bishop presented to the marshal, and then, being close beside her, he laid his hand on the marshal's shoulder, and said to her, "Nonna, what thinkest thou of this gentleman, that thou mightst make a conquest of him?" Which words the lady resented as a gibe at her honour, and like to tarnish it in the eyes of those who were not a few, in whose hearing they were spoken. Wherefore, without bestowing a thought upon the vindication of her honour, but being minded to return blow for blow, she retorted hastily, "Perchance, sir, he might not make a conquest of me, but if he did so, I should want good money." The answer stung both the marshal and the bishop to the quick, the one as contriver of the scurvy trick played upon the bishop's brother in regard of his niece, the other as thereby outraged in the person of his brother's niece, insomuch that they dared not look one another in the face, but took themselves off in shame and silence, and said never a word more to her that day. In such a case, then, the lady having received a bite, 'twas allowable in her wittily to return it. End of Day 6, the Third Story.
Day 6, the Fourth Story. Cicibio, cook to Corrado Gianfigliazzi, owes his safety to a ready answer, whereby he converts Corrado's wrath into laughter, and evades the evil fate with which Corrado had threatened him.
Lauretta being now silent, all lauded Nonna to the skies, after which Neifile received the Queen's command to follow suit, and thus began.
Albeit, loving ladies, ready wit not seldom ministers words apt and excellent and congruous with the circumstances of the speakers, 'tis also true that fortune at times comes to the aid of the timid, and unexpectedly sets words upon the tongue which in a quiet hour the speaker could never have found for himself. The which 'tis my purpose to show you by my story. Corrado Gianfigliazzi, as the eyes and ears of each of you may bear witness, has ever been a noble citizen of our city, open-handed and magnificent, and one that lived as a gentleman should with hounds and hawks, in which, to say nothing at present of more important matters, he found unfailing delight. Now, having one day hard by Peretola dispatched a crane with one of his falcons, finding it young and plump, he sent it to his excellent cook, a Venetian, Cicibio by name, bidding him roast it for supper, and make a dainty dish of it. Cicibio, who looked, as he was, a very green head, had dressed the crane and set it to the fire, and was cooking it carefully, when, the bird being all but roasted, and the fumes of the cooking very strong, it so chanced that a girl, Brunetta by name, that lived in the same street, and of whom Cicibio was greatly enamoured, came into the kitchen, and perceiving the smell and seeing the bird, began coaxing Cicibio to give her a thigh. By way of answer, Cicibio fell a singing, "You get it not from me, Madame Brunetta, you get it not from me." Whereat Madame Brunetta was offended, and said to him, "By God, if thou givest it me not, thou shalt never have aught from me to pleasure thee." In short, there was not a little altercation, and in the end Cicibio, fain not to vex his mistress, cut off one of the crane's thighs and gave it to her. So the bird was set before Corrado and some strangers that he had at table with him. And Corrado, observing that it had but one thigh, was surprised, and sent for Cicibio, and demanded of him what was become of the missing thigh. Whereto the mendacious Venetian answered readily, "The crane, sir, has but one thigh and one leg." "What the devil!" rejoined Corrado in a rage. "So the crane has but one thigh and one leg? Think'st thou I never saw crane before this?" But Cicibio continued, "'Tis even so as I say, sir, and so please you, I will show you that so it is in the living bird." Corrado had too much respect for his guests to pursue the topic. He only said, "Since thou promisest to show me in the living bird what I have never seen or heard tell of, I bid thee do so to-morrow, and I shall be satisfied. But if thou fail, I swear to thee by the body of Christ that I will serve thee so that thou shalt ruefully remember my name for the rest of thy days." No more was said of the matter that evening, but on the morrow at daybreak, Corrado, who had by no means slept off his wrath, got up still swelling therewith, and ordered his horses, mounted Cicibio on a hackney, and saying to him, "We shall soon see which of us lied yesternight, thou or I," set off with him for a place where there was much water, beside which there were always cranes to be seen about dawn. Cicibio, observing that Corrado's ire was unabated, and knowing not how to bolster up his lie, rode by Corrado's side in a state of the utmost trepidation, and would gladly, had he been able, have taken to flight. But as he might not, he glanced now ahead, now aback, now aside, and saw everywhere naught but cranes standing on 2 feet. However, as they approached the river, the very first thing they saw upon the bank was a round dozen of cranes, standing each and all on 1 foot, as is their wont when asleep. When Cicibio presently pointed out to Corrado, saying, "Now may you see well enough, sir, that 'tis true as I said yesternight, that the crane has but 1 thigh and 1 leg. Mark but how they stand over there." Whereupon Corrado, "Wait," quoth he, "and I will show thee that they have each thighs and legs twain." So having drawn a little nigher to them, he ejaculated, "Oh!" which caused the cranes to bring each the other foot to the ground, and after hopping a step or 2, to take to flight. Corrado then turned to Cicibio, saying, "How now, rogue? Art satisfied that the bird has thighs and legs twain?" Whereto Cicibio, all but beside himself with fear, made answer, "Ay, sir, but you cried not 'Oh ho!' to our crane of yestereve. Had you done so, it would have popped its other thigh and foot forth, as these have done." Which answer Corrado so much relished, that all his wrath changed to jollity and laughter. "Cicibio," quoth he, "thou art right. Indeed I ought to have so done." Thus did Cicibio by his ready and jocund retort arrest impending evil, and make his peace with his master. End of Day 6, the 4th Story.
Day 6, the 5th Story. Messer Forese de Rabatta and Master Giotto, the painter, journeying together from Mugello, deride one another's scurvy appearance.
Nay, Phila being silent, and the ladies having made very merry over Cicibio's retort, Pamphilo at the Queen's command thus spoke:
"Dearest ladies, if fortune, as Pampanea has shown us, does sometimes hide treasures most rich of native worth in the obscurity of base occupations, so, in like manner, 'tis not seldom found that nature has enshrined prodigies of wit in the most ignoble of human forms. Whereof a notable example is afforded by 2 of our citizens, of whom I purposed for a brief while to discourse. The one, Messer Forese da Rabatta by name, was short and deformed of person, and withal flat-cheeked and flat-nosed, insomuch that never a Baroncio had a visage so misshapen, but his would have showed as hideous beside it. Yet so conversant was this man with the laws, that by not a few of those well able to form an opinion, he was reputed a veritable storehouse of civil jurisprudence. The other, whose name was Giotto, was of so excellent a wit, that, let nature, mother of all, operant ever by continual revolution of the heavens, fashion what she would, he, with his style and pen and pencil, would depict its like on such wise that it showed not as its like, but rather as the thing itself, insomuch that the visual sense of men did often err in regard thereof, mistaking for real that which was but painted. Wherefore, having brought back to light that art which had for many ages lain buried beneath the blunders of those who painted rather to delight the eyes of the ignorant than to satisfy the intelligence of the wise, he may deservedly be called one of the lights that compose the glory of Florence, and the more so, the more lowly was the spirit in which he won that glory, who, albeit he was, while he yet lived, the master of others, yet did ever refuse to be called their master. And this title that he rejected adorned him with a lustre the more splendid in proportion to the avidity with which it was usurped by those who were less knowing than he, or were his pupils. But for all the exceeding greatness of his art, yet in no particular had he the advantage of Messer Farese, either in form or in feature. But to come to the story. 'Twas in Mugello that Messer Farese, as likewise Giotto, had his country seat, whence, returning from a sojourn that he had made there during the summer vacation of the courts, and being, as it chanced, mounted on a poor jade of a draught horse, he fell in with the said Giotto, who was also on his way back to Florence, after a like sojourn on his own estate, and was neither better mounted, nor in any other wise better equipped, than Messer Farese. And so, being both old men, they jogged on together at a slow pace, and being surprised by a sudden shower, such as we frequently see fall in summer, they presently sought shelter in the house of a husbandman that was known to each of them, and was their friend. But after a while, as the rain gave no sign of ceasing, and they had a mind to be at Florence that same day, they borrowed of the husbandman 2 old cloaks of Romagnole cloth, and 2 hats, much the worse for age, there being no better to be had, and resumed their journey. Whereon they had not proceeded far, when, taking note that they were soaked through and through, and liberally splashed with the mud cast up by their nags' hoofs, circumstances which are not of a kind to add to one's dignity, they, after a long silence, the sky beginning to brighten a little, began to converse, and Messer Farese, as he rode and hearkened to Giotto, who was an excellent talker, surveyed him sideways, and from head to foot, and all over, and seeing him in all points in so sorry and scurvy a trim, and recking naught of his own appearance, broke into a laugh, and said, Giotto, would e'er a stranger that met us, and had not seen thee before, believe, think'st thou, that thou wert, as thou art, the greatest painter in the world? Whereto Giotto answered promptly, Methinks, sir, he might, if, scanning you, he gave you credit for knowing the ABC. Which hearing, Messer Farese recognized his error, and perceived that he had gotten as good as he brought. End of Day 6, the 5th Story.
Day 6, the 6th Story. Michele Scalza proves to certain young men that the Baronci are the best gentlemen in the world and the Maremma, and wins a supper.
The ladies were still laughing over Giotto's ready retort, when the queen charged Fiammetta to follow suit, wherefore thus Fiammetta began.
Pamphilus' mention of the Baronci, who to you, damsels, are perchance not so well known as to him, has brought to my mind a story in which 'tis shown how great is their nobility, and for that it devolves no deviation from our rule of discourse, I am minded to tell it you. 'Tis no long time since there dwelt in our city a young man, Michele Scalza by name, the pleasantest and merriest fellow in the world, and the best furnished with quaint stories, for which reason the Florentine youth set great store in having him with them when they foregathered in company. Now it so befell that one day, he being with a party of them at Montughi, they fell a disputing together on this wise, to wit, who were the best gentlemen and of the longest descent in Florence. One said the Uberti, another the Lamberti, or some other family, according to the predilection of the speaker. Whereat Scalza began to smile, and said, Now out upon you, blockheads that ye are, ye know not what ye say. The best gentleman, and of longest descent in all the world and the Maremma, let alone Florence, are the Baronci by the common consent of all philosophers, and all that know them as I do. And lest ye should otherwise conceive me, I say that 'tis of your neighbours the Baronci of Santa Maria Maggiore that I speak. Whereupon the young men, who had looked for somewhat else from him, said derisively, Thou dost but jest with us, as if we did not know the Baronci as well as thou. quoth Scalza. By the Gospels I jest not, but speak sooth, and if there is any of you will wager a supper to be given to the winner and 6 good fellows whom he shall choose, I will gladly do the like, and, what is more, I will abide by the decision of such one of you as you may choose. Then said one of them, whose name was Neri Mannini, I am ready to adventure this supper, and so they agreed together that Piero di Fiorentino, in whose house they were, should be judge, and hied them to him, followed by all the rest, eager to see Scalza lose, and triumph in his discomfiture, and told Piero all that had been said. Piero, who was a young man of sound sense, heard what Neri had to say, and then turning to Scalza, And how, quoth he, mayst thou make good what thou averest? I will demonstrate it, returned Scalza, by reasoning so cogent that not only you, but he that denies it, shall acknowledge that I say sooth. You know, and so they were saying but now, that the longer men's descent, the better is their gentility, and I say that the Baronci are of longer descent, and thus better gentlemen than any other men. If, then, I prove to you that they are of longer descent than any other men, without a doubt the victory in this dispute will rest with me. Now you must know that when God made the Baronci, he was but a novice in his art, of which, when he made the rest of mankind, he was already master. And to assure yourself that herein I say sooth, you have but to consider the Baronci, how they differ from the rest of mankind, who all have faces well composed and duly proportioned, whereas of the Baronci you will see one with a face very long and narrow, another with a face inordinately broad, one with a very long nose, another with a short one, one with a protruding and upturned chin and great jaws like an ass's, and again there will be one that has one eye larger than its fellow, or set on a lower plane, so that their faces resemble those that children make when they begin to learn to draw. Whereby, as I said, 'tis plainly manifest that when God made them, he was but novice in his art, and so they are of longer descent than the rest of mankind, and by consequence better gentlemen. By which entertaining argument Piero the judge, and Neri, who had wagered the supper, and all the rest, calling to mind the Baronci's ugliness, were so tickled that they fell a-laughing, and averred that Scalza was in the right, and that he had won the wager, and that without a doubt the Baronci were the best gentlemen, and of the longest descent, not merely in Florence, but in the world and the Maremma to boot. Wherefore it was not without reason that Pamphilo, being minded to declare Messer Forese's ill-favouredness, said that he would have been hideous beside a Baroncio. End of Day 6, the 6th Story.
Day 6, the 7th Story. Madonna Philippa, being found by her husband with her lover, is cited before the court, and by a ready and jocund answer acquits herself, and brings about an alteration of the statute.
Fiammetta had been silent some time, but Scalza's novel argument to prove the preeminent nobility of the Baronci kept all still laughing, when the queen called for a story from Philostrato, who thus began:
Noble ladies, an excellent thing is apt speech on all occasions, but to be proficient therein I deem then most excellent when the occasion does most imperatively demand it, as was the case with the gentlewoman, of whom I propose to speak to you, who not only ministered gaiety and merriment to her heroes, but extricated herself, as you saw here, from the toils of an ignominious death. There was aforetime in the city of Prato a statute, no less censurable than harsh, which, making no distinction between the wife whom her husband took in adultery with her lover, and the woman found pleasuring a stranger for money, condemned both alike to be burned. While this statute was in force, it befell that a gentlewoman, fair and beyond measure enamoured, Madonna Philippa by name, was by her husband, Rinaldo de Pugliese, found in her own chamber one night in the arms of Lazzarino de Guazzagliotri, a handsome young noble of the same city, whom she loved even as herself. Whereat Rinaldo, very wroth, scarce refrained from falling upon them and killing them on the spot, and indeed, but that he doubted how he should afterwards fare himself, he had given way to the vehemence of his anger, and so done. Nor, though he so far mastered himself, could he forbear recourse to the statute, thereby to compass that he might not otherwise lawfully compass, to wit, the death of his lady. Wherefore, having all the evidence needful to prove her guilt, he took no further counsel, but, as soon as 'twas day, he charged the lady, and had her summoned. Like most ladies that are veritably enamoured, the lady was of high courage, and though not a few of her friends and kinsfolk sought to dissuade her, she resolved to appear to the summons, having liefer die bravely confessing the truth than basely free, and for defiance of the law live in exile, and show herself unworthy of such a lover as had in her arms that night. And so, attended by many ladies and gentlemen, who all exhorted her to deny the charge, she came before the podesta, and with a composed air and unfaltering voice asked whereof he would interrogate her. The podesta, surveying her, and taking note of her extraordinary beauty and exquisite manners, and the high courage that her words evinced, was touched with compassion for her, fearing that she might make some admission, by reason whereof, to save his honour, he must needs do her to death. But still, as he could not refrain from examining her of which was laid to her charge, he said, "Madam, here, as you see, is your husband Rinaldo, who prefers a charge against you, alleging that he has taken you in adultery, and so he demands that, pursuant to a statute which is in force here, I punish you with death. But this I may not do, except you confess. Wherefore be very careful what you answer, and tell me if what your husband alleges against you be true." The lady, nowise dismayed, and in a tone not a little jocund, thus made answer: "True it is, sir, that Rinaldo is my husband, and that last night he found me in the arms of Lazzarino, in whose arms for the whole-hearted love that I bear him I have oftentimes laid. Nor shall I ever deny, but as well I wot you know, the laws ought to be common and enacted with the common consent of all they affect, which conditions are wanting to this law, insomuch as it binds only us poor women, in whom to be liberal is much less reprehensible than it were in men, and therefore the consent of no woman was, I say not had, but so much as asked before 'twas made, for which reasons it justly deserves to be called a bad law. However, if in scathe of my body and your own soul you are minded to put it to force, 'tis your own affair, but I pray you, go not on to try this matter in any wise, until you have granted me this trifling grace, to wit, to ask my husband if I ever gainsayed him, and did not rather accord him, when and so often he crave it, complete enjoyment of myself." Whereto Rinaldo, having awaited the podesta's question, forthwith answered that assuredly the lady had granted him all that he had asked of her for his gratification. "Then," promptly continued the lady, "if he has ever had of me as much as sufficed for his solace, what was I or am I to do with the surplus? Am I to cast it to the dogs? Is it not better to bestow it on a gentleman that loves me more dearly than himself, than to suffer it to come to naught, or worse?" Which jocund question being heard by well nigh all the folk of Prato, who had flocked thither all agog to see a dame so fair and of such quality on her trial for such an offence, they laughed loud and long, and then all with one accord, and as with one voice, exclaimed that the lady was in the right, and said well. Nor left they the court until, in concert with the podesta, they had so altered the harsh statute as thenceforth only such women as should wrong their husbands for money should be within its purview. Wherefore Rinaldo left the court, discomfited of his foolish enterprise, and the lady, blithe and free as if rendered back to life from the burning, went home triumphant. End of Day 6, the 7th Story.
Day 6, The Eighth Story. Fresco admonishes his niece not to look at herself in the glass if 'tis, as she says, grievous to her to see nasty folk.
It was not at first without some flutterings of shame, evinced by the modest blush mantling on their cheeks, that the ladies heard Philostratos' story, but afterwards, exchanging glances, they could scarce forbear to laugh, and hearkened tittering. However, when he had done, the Queen turning to Emilia bade her follow suit. Whereupon Emilia, fetching a deep breath, as if she were roused from sleep, thus began.
Loving ladies, brooding thought has kept my spirit for so long time remote from here, that perchance I may make a shift to satisfy our Queen with a much shorter story than would have been forthcoming but for my absence of mind, wherein I propose to tell you how a young woman's folly was corrected by her uncle with a pleasant jest, had she but had the sense to apprehend it. My story, then, is of one, Fresco da Celatico by name, that had a niece, Cesca, as she was playfully called, who, being fair of face and person, albeit she had none of those angelical charms that we ofttimes see, had so superlative a conceit of herself, that she had contracted a habit of disparaging both men and women, and all that she saw, entirely regardless of her own defects, though for odiousness, tiresomeness, and petulance she had not her match among women, insomuch that there was naught that could be done to her mind. Besides which, such was her pride, that had she been of the blood royal of France, 'twould have been inordinate. And when she walked abroad, so fastidious was her humour, that she was ever averting her head, as if there was never a soul she saw or met but reeked with a foul smell. Now one day, not to speak of other odious and tiresome ways that she had, it so befell that being come home, where Fresco was, she sat herself down beside him with a most languishing air, and did naught but fume and chafe. Whereupon, "Cesca," quoth he, "what means this, that, though 'tis a feast day, yet thou art come back so soon?" She, all but dissolved with her vapourish humours, made answer, "Why, the truth is, that I am come back early, because never, I believe, were there such odious and tiresome men and women in this city as there are to-day. I cannot pass a soul in the street that I loathe not like ill luck, and I believe there is not a woman in the world that is so distressed by the sight of odious people as I am, and so I am come home thus soon to avoid the sight of them." Whereupon Fresco, to whom his niece's bad manners were distasteful in the extreme, "Daughter," quoth he, "if thou loathe odious folk as much as thou sayest, thou wert best, so thou wouldst live happy, never to look at thyself in the glass." But she, empty as a reed, albeit in her own conceit a match for Solomon in wisdom, was as far as any sheep from apprehending the true sense of her uncle's jest, but answered that on the contrary she was minded to look at herself in the glass like other women. And so she remained, and yet remains, hide-bound in her folly. End of Day 6, the 8th Story.
Day 6, the 9th Story. Guido Cavalcanti, by a quip, meekly rebukes certain Florentine gentlemen who had taken him at a disadvantage.
The Queen, perceiving that Emilia had finished her story, and that none but she, and he who had the privilege of speaking last, now remained to tell, began on this wise.
Albeit debonair, my ladies, you have forestalled me today of more than 2 of the stories, of which I had thought to tell one, yet one is still left me to recount, which carries at the close of it a quip of such a sort that perhaps we have as yet heard not so pregnant. You are to know then that in former times there obtained in our city customs excellent and commendable not a few, whereof today not one is left to us, thanks to the greed which, growing with the wealth of our folk, has banished them all from among us. One of which customs was that in divers quarters of Florence the gentlemen that there resided would assemble together in companies of a limited number, taking care to include therein only such as might conveniently bear the expenses, and today one, another tomorrow, each in his turn for a day, would entertain the rest of the company, and so they would not seldom do honor to gentlemen from distant parts when they visited the city, and also to their fellow citizens, and in like manner they would meet together at least once a year, all in the same trim, and on the most notable days would ride together through the city, and now and again they would tilt together, more especially on the greater feasts, or when the city was rejoiced by tidings of victory or some other glad event. Among which companies was one of which Messer Betto Brunelleschi was the leading spirit, into which Messer Betto and his comrades had striven hard to bring Guido, son of Cavalcante de Cavalcanti, and not without reason, inasmuch as, beside being one of the best logicians in the world, and an excellent natural philosopher, qualities of which the company made no great account, he was without a peer for gallantry and courtesy, and excellence of discourse, and aptitude for all manners which he might set his mind to, and that belonged to a gentleman. And therewithal he was very rich, and when he deemed any worthy of honour, knew how to bestow it to the uttermost. But as Messer Betto had never been able to gain him over, he and his comrades supposed that 'twas because Guido, being addicted to speculation, was thereby estranged from men, and for that he was somewhat inclined to the opinion of the Epicureans. The vulgar averred that these speculations of his had no other scope than to prove that God did not exist. Now, one day it so befell that, Guido being come, as was not seldom his wont, from Or San Michele by the Corso degli Adimari as far as San Giovanni, around which were then the great tombs of marble that are today in Santa Reparata, besides other tombs not a few, and Guido being between the columns of porphyry that are there and the tombs and the door of San Giovanni, which was locked, Messer Betto and his company came riding on to the piazza of Santa Reparata, and seeing him among the tombs, said, "Go we and flout him." So they set spurs to their horses, and making a mock onset, were upon him almost before he saw them. Whereupon, "Guido," they began, "thou wilt be none of our company, but, lo now, when thou hast proved that God does not exist, what wilt thou have achieved?" Guido, seeing that he was surrounded, presently answered, "Gentlemen, you may say to me what you please in your own house." Thereupon he laid his hand on one of the great tombs, and being very nimble, vaulted over it, and so evaded them, and went his way, while they remained gazing in one another's faces, and some said that he had taken leave of his wits, and that his answer was but naught, seeing that the ground on which they stood was common to them with the rest of the citizens, and among them Guido himself. But Messer Betto, turning to them, "Nay, but," quoth he, "'tis ye that have taken leave of your wits, if ye have not understood him, for meetly and in few words he has given us never so shrewd a reprimand, seeing that if you consider it well, these tombs are the houses of the dead that are laid and tarry therein, which he calls our house, to show us that we, and all other simple unlettered men, are, in comparison of him and the rest of the learned, in sorrier case than dead men, and so being here, we are in our own house." Then none was there but understood Guido's meaning, and was abashed, insomuch that they flouted him no more, and thenceforth reputed Messer Betto a gentleman of a subtle and discerning wit. End of Day 6. The 9th Story.
Day 6. The 10th Story. Frau Cipolo promises to show certain country folk a feather of the angel Gabriel, in lieu of which he finds coals, which he avers to be those with which St. Lawrence was roasted.
All the company, save Dioneo, being delivered of their several stories, he wist that it was his turn to speak, Wherefore, without awaiting any very express command, he enjoined silence on those that were commending Guido's pithy quip, and thus began.
Sweet my ladies, albeit 'tis my privilege to speak of what likes me most, I purpose not to-day to deviate from that theme whereon you have all discoursed most appositely, but, following in your footsteps, I am minded to show you with what adroitness and readiness of resource one of the friars of St. Anthony avoided a pickle that two young men had in readiness for him. Nor, if in order to do the story full justice I be somewhat prolix of speech, should it be burdensome to you, if you will but glance at the sun, which is yet in mid-heaven. Certaldo, as perchance you may have heard, is a town of Valdezza within our countryside, which, small though it is, had in it aforetime people of rank and wealth. Thither, for that there he found good pasture, 'twas long the wont of one of the friars of St. Anthony to resort once every year, to collect the alms that fools gave him. Friar Chippeller, so hight the friar, met with a hearty welcome, no less perchance by reason of his name than for other cause, the onions produced in that district being famous throughout Tuscany. He was little of person, red-haired, jolly-visaged, and the very best of good fellows. And therewithal, though learning he had none, he was so excellent and ready a speaker, that whoso knew him not would not only have esteemed him a great rhetorician, but would have pronounced him Tully himself, or perchance Quintilian, and in all the countryside there was scarce a soul to whom he was not either gossip, or friend, or lover. Being thus wont from time to time to visit Certaldo, the friar came there once upon a time in the month of August, and on a Sunday morning, all the good folk of the neighbouring farms being come to mass in the parish church, he took occasion to come forward and say, "Ladies and gentlemen, you wot 'tis your custom to send year by year to the poor of Baron Master St. Anthony somewhat of your wheat and oats, more or less according to the ability and devoutness of each, that blessed St. Anthony may save your oxen and asses and pigs and sheep from harm. And you are also accustomed, and especially those whose names are on the books of our confraternity, to pay your trifling annual dues, to collect which offerings I am hither sent by my superior, to wit, Master Abbot, wherefore, with the blessing of God, after noon, when you hear the bells ring, you will come out of the church to the place where, in the usual way, I shall deliver you my sermon, and you will kiss the cross. And therewithal, knowing as I do that you are one and all most devoted to Baron Master St. Anthony, I will, by way of especial grace, show you a most holy and goodly relic, which I brought myself from the Holy Land overseas, which is none other than one of the feathers of the angel Gabriel, which he left behind him in the room of the Virgin Mary, when he came to make her the Annunciation in Nazareth." And having said thus much, he ceased, and went on with the mass. Now, among the many that were in the church, while Fra Chippeller made this speech, were two very wily young wags, the one Giovanni del Bragioniere by name, and the other Biagio Pizzini, who, although they were on the best of terms with Fra Chippeller, and much in his company, had a sly laugh together over the relic, and resolved to make game of him and his feather. So, having learnt that Fra Chippeller was to breakfast that morning in the town with one of his friends, as soon as they knew that he was at table, down they hied them into the street, and to the inn where the friar lodged, having complotted that Biagio should keep the friar's servant in play, while Giovanni made search among the friar's goods and chattels for this feather, whatever it might be, to carry it off, that they might see how the friar would afterwards explain the matter to the people. Now Fra Chippeller had for servant one Guccio, whom some called by way of addition Balena, others Imbrata, others again Porco, and who was such a rascallion that sure it is that Lippo Topo himself never painted his like. Concerning whom Fra Chippeller would ofttimes make merry with his familiars, saying, "My servant has 9 qualities, any one of which in Solomon, Aristotle, or Seneca would have been enough to spoil all their virtue, wisdom, and holiness. Consider, then, what sort of man he must be that has these 9 qualities, and yet never a mark of either virtue, or wisdom, or holiness." And being asked upon divers occasions what these 9 qualities might be, he strung them together in rhyme, and answered, I will tell you, lazy, uncleanly, and a liar he is, negligent, disobedient, and foul-mouthed, I wis, and reckless, and witless, and mannerless. And therewithal he has some other petty vices, which were best to pass over. And the most amusing thing about him is that wherever he goes he is for taking a wife and renting a house, and on the strength of a big, black, greasy beard, he deems himself so very handsome a fellow, and seductive, that he takes all the women that see him to be in love with him, and if he were left alone he would slip his girdle and run after them all. True it is that he is of great use to me, for that, be any minded to speak with me never so secretly, he must still have his share of the audience, and if perchance aught is demanded of me, such is his fear lest I should be at a loss what answer to make, that he presently replies, ay or no, as he deems meet. Now, when he left this knave at the inn, Fra Chipolo had strictly enjoined him on no account to suffer any one to touch aught of his, and least of all his wallet, because it contained the holy things. But Guccio Imbrata, who was fonder of the kitchen than any nightingale of the green boughs, and most particular if he espied there a maid, and in the host kitchen had caught sight of a coarse fat woman, short and misshapen, with a pair of breasts that showed as two buckets of muck, and a face that might have belonged to one of the Baronci, all reeking with sweat and grease and smoke, left Fra Chipolo's room and all his things to take care of themselves, and like a vulture swooping down upon the carrion, was in the kitchen in a trice, where, though 'twas August, he sat him down by the fire, and fell a gossiping with Nuta, such was the maid's name, and told her that he was a gentleman by procuration, and had more florins than could be reckoned, besides those that he had to give away, which were rather more than less, and that he could do and say such things as never were or might be seen or heard for ever, Lord and a day, and all heedless of his cowl, which had as much grease upon it as would have furnished forth the cauldron of Altopascio, and of his rent and patched doublet, inlaid with filth about the neck and under the armpits, and so stained that it showed hues more various than did ever silk from Tartary or the Indies, and of his shoes that were all to pieces, and of his hose that were all in tatters. He told her, in a tone that would have become Sieur de Chatillon, that he was minded to rehabit her, and put her in trim, and raise her from her abject condition, and place her where, though she would not have much to call her own, at any rate she would have hope of better things, and with much more to the like effect. Which professions, though made with every appearance of good will, proved, like most of his schemes, insubstantial as air, and came to nothing. Finding Guccio Porco thus occupied with Nuta, the two young men gleefully accounted their work half done, and, none gainsaying them, entered Fra Chipolo's room, which was open, and lit at once upon the wallet, in which was the feather. The wallet opened, they found, wrapped up in many folds of taffeta, a little casket, on opening which they discovered one of the tail feathers of a parrot, which they deemed must be that which the friar had promised to show the good folk of Certaldo. And in sooth he might well have so imposed upon them, for in those days the luxuries of Egypt had scarce been introduced into Tuscany, though they have since been brought over in prodigious abundance, to the grave hurt of all Italy. And though some conversance with them there was, yet in those parts folk knew next to nothing of them, but adhering to the honest simple ways of their forefathers, had not seen, nay for the most part had not so much as heard tell of a parrot. So the young men, having found the feather, took it out with great glee, and looking around for something to replace it, they espied in a corner of the room some pieces of coal, wherewith they filled the casket, which they then closed, and having set the room in order exactly as they had found it, they quitted it unperceived, and hied them merrily off with the feather, and posted themselves where they might hear what Fra Chipolo would say when he found the coals in its stead. Mass said, the simple folk that were in the church went home with the tidings that the feather of the angel Gabriel was to be seen after noon. And this good man telling his neighbour, and that good wife her gossip, by the time every one had breakfasted, the town could scarce hold the multitude of men and women that flocked thither all agog to see this feather. Fra Chipolo, having made a hearty breakfast and had a little nap, got up shortly after noon, and marking the great concourse of country folk that were come to see the feather, sent word to Guccio Imbrata to go up there with the bells and bring him the wallet. Guccio, though was 'with difficulty that he tore himself away from the kitchen and Nuta, hied him up with the things required. And though, when he got up, he was winded, for he was corpulent with drinking naught but water, he did Fra Cipolla's bidding by going to the church door and ringing the bells amain. When all the people were gathered about the door, Fra Cipolla, all unwitting that aught of his was missing, began his sermon, and after much said in glorification of himself, caused the Confiator to be recited with great solemnity, and 2 torches to be lit by way of preliminary to the showing of the feather of the angel Gabriel. He then bared his head, carefully unfolded the taffeta, and took out the casket, which, after a few prefatory words in praise and laudation of the angel Gabriel and his relic, he opened. When he saw that it contained naught but coals, he did not suspect Guccio Balaena of playing the trick, for he knew that he was not clever enough, nor did he curse him that his carelessness had allowed another to play it, but he only imprecated himself that he had committed his things to the keeping of one whom he knew to be negligent and disobedient, reckless and witless. Nevertheless, he changed not colour, but with face and hands upturned to heaven, he said, in a voice that all might hear, O God, blessed be thy might for ever and ever. Then, closing the casket and turning to the people, Ladies and gentlemen, he said, you ought to know that when I was yet a very young man, I was sent by my superior into those parts where the sun rises, and I was expressly bidden to search until I should find the privileges of porcellana, which, though they cost nothing to seal, are of much more use to others than to us. On which errand I set forth, taking my departure from Venice, and traversing the Borgo di Greci, and thence on horseback the realm of the Algarve, and so by Baldaccia I came to Parione, whence, somewhat athirst, I after a while got on to Sardinia. But wherefore go I about to enumerate all the lands in which I pursued my quest? Having passed the Straits of San Giorgio, I arrived at Trufia and Bufia, countries thickly populated and with great nations, whence I pursued my journey to Menzogna, where I met with many of our own brethren, and of other religious not a few, intent, one and all, on eschewing hardship for the love of God, making little account of others' toil, so that they might ensue their own advantage, and paying in naught but unminted coin throughout the length and breadth of the country. And so I came to the land of the Abruzzi, where the men and women go in pattens on the mountains, and clothe the hogs with their own entrails. And a little further on I found folk that carried bread in staves and wine in sacks. And leaving them, I arrived at the mountains of the Bacci, where all the waters run downwards. In short, I penetrated so far that I came at last to India Pastinaccia, where I swear to you by the habit that I wear, that I saw pruning hooks fly, a thing that none would believe that had not seen it. Whereof be my witness that I lie not, Maso d'Asagio, that great merchant, whom I found there cracking nuts and selling the shells by retail. However, not being able to find that whereof I was in quest, because from thence one must travel by water, I turned back, and so came at length to the Holy Land, where in summer cold bread costs 4 deniers, and hot bread is to be had for nothing. And there I found the venerable father, Non mi blasmet se voi piace, the most worshipful patriarch of Jerusalem, who, out of respect for the habit that I have ever worn, to wit, that of Baron Master St. Anthony, was pleased to let me see all the holy relics that he had by him, which was so many, that were I to enumerate them all, I should not come to the end of them in some miles. However, not to disappoint you, I will tell you a few of them. In the first place, then, he showed me the finger of the Holy Spirit, as whole and entire as it ever was, and the tuft of the seraph that appeared to St. Francis, and one of the nails of the cherubim, and one of the ribs of the verbum cario hithely to the casement, and some of the vestments of the Holy Catholic faith, and some of the rays of the star that appeared to the Magi in the east, and a phial of the sweat of St. Michael, a battling with the devil, and the jaws of death of St. Lazarus, and other relics. And for that I gave him a liberal supply of the acclivities of Monte Morello in the Vulgar, and some chapters of the Caprezio, of which he had long been in quest, he was pleased to let me participate in his holy relics, and gave me one of the teeth of the Holy Cross, and in a small phial a bit of the sound of the bells of Solomon's temple, and this feather of the angel Gabriel, whereof I have told you, and one of the patterns of San Gerardo de Villamagna, which not long ago I gave at Florence to Gerardo de Monsi, who holds him in prodigious veneration. He also gave me some of the coals with which the most blessed martyr St. Lawrence was roasted. All which things I devoutly brought thence, and have them all safe. True it is that my superior hath not hitherto permitted me to show them, until he should be certified that they are genuine. However, now that this is avouched by certain miracles wrought by them, of which we have tidings by letter from the patriarch, he has given me leave to show them. But, fearing to trust them to another, I always carry them with me, and, to tell you the truth, I carry the feather of the angel Gabriel, lest it should get spoiled, in a casket, and the coals with which St. Lawrence was roasted in another casket, which caskets are so like the one to the other, that not seldom I mistake one for the other, which has befallen me on this occasion. For whereas I thought to have brought with me the casket wherein is the feather, I have brought instead that which contains the coals. Nor deem I this a mischance. Nay, methinks 'tis by the interposition of God, and that he himself put the casket of coals in my hand. For I mind me that the feast of St. Lawrence falls but 2 days hence. Wherefore God, being minded that by showing you the coals with which he was roasted, I should rekindle in your souls the devotion that you ought to feel towards him, guided my hand not to the feather which I meant to take, but to the blessed coals that were extinguished by the humours that exuded from that most holy body. And so, blessed children, bear your heads, and devoutly draw nigh to see them. But first of all I would have you know, that whoso has the sign of the cross made upon him with these coals may live secure for the whole of the ensuing year, that fire shall not touch him, that he feel it not. Having so said, the friar, chanting a hymn in praise of St. Lawrence, opened the casket and showed the coals. Whereon the foolish crowd gazed a while in awe and reverent wonder, and then came pressing forward in a mighty throng about Fra Cipolla with offerings beyond their wont, each and all praying him to touch them with the coals. Wherefore Fra Cipolla took the coals in his hand, and set about making on their white blouses, and on their doublets, and on the veils of the women, crosses as big as might be, averring the while that whatever the coals might thus lose would be made good to them again in the casket, as he had often proved. On this wise, to his exceeding great profit, he marked all the folk of Certaldo with the cross, and, thanks to his ready wit and resource, had his laugh at those who, by robbing him of the feather, thought to make a laughing stock of him. They, indeed, being among his hearers, and marking his novel expedient, and how voluble he was, and what a long story he made of it, laughed till they thought their jaws would break. And when the congregation was dispersed, they went up to him, and never so merrily told him what they had done, and returned him his feather, which next year proved to be no less lucrative to him than that day the coals had been. End of Day 6, the 10th Story.
Day the 6th. The Conclusion. Immense was the delight and diversion which this story afforded to all the company alike, and great and general was the laughter over Fra Cipolla, and more especially at his pilgrimage, and the relics, as well those that he had but seen as those that he had brought back with him. Which being ended, the Queen, taking note that therewith the close of their sovereignty was come, stood up, took off the crown, and set it on Dioneo's head, saying with a laugh, "'Tis time, Dioneo, that thou prove the weight of the burden of having ladies to govern and guide. Be thou king then, and let thy rule be such, that when 'tis ended we may have cause to commend it." Dioneo took the crown, and laughingly answered, kings worthier far than I you may well have seen many a time ere now. I speak of the kings in chess. But let me have of you that obedience which is due to a true king, and of a surety I will give you to taste of that solace, without which perfection of joy there may not be in any festivity. But enough on this. I will govern as best I may. Then, as was the wont, he sent for the seneschal, and gave him particular instruction how to order matters during the term of his sovereignty, which done, he said, Noble ladies, such and so diverse has been our discourse of the ways of men and their various fortunes, that but for the visit that we had a while ago from Madame Lekiska, who by what she said has furnished me with matter of discourse for tomorrow, I doubt I had been not a little put to it to find a theme. You heard how she said that there was not a woman in her neighbourhood whose husband had her virginity, adding that well she knew how many and what manner of tricks they, after marriage, played their husbands. The first count we may well leave to the girls whom it concerns. The second, methinks, should prove a diverting topic. Wherefore I ordain that, taking our cue from Madame Lekiska, we discourse tomorrow of the tricks that either for love or for their deliverance from peril ladies have heretofore played their husbands, and whether they were by the said husbands detected or no. To discourse of such a topic, some of the ladies deemed unmeet for them, and besought the king to find another theme. But the king made answer, Ladies, what manner of theme I have prescribed I know as well as you, nor was I to be diverted from prescribing it by that which you now think to declare unto me. For I wot the times are such that so only men and women have a care to do, naught that is unseemly, 'tis allowable to them to discourse of what they please. For in sooth, as you must know, so out of joint are the times that the judges have deserted the judgment seat, the laws are silent, and ample license to preserve his life as best he may is accorded to each and all. Wherefore, if you are somewhat less strict of speech than is your wont, not that aught unseemly in act may follow, but that you may afford solace to yourselves and others, I see not how you can be open to reasonable censure on the part of any. Furthermore, naught that has been said from the first day to the present moment has, methinks, in any degree sullied the immaculate honour of your company, nor, God helping us, shall aught ever sully it. Besides, who is there that knows not the quality of your honour, which were proof, I make no doubt, against not only the seductive influence of diverting discourse, but even the terror of death? And to tell you the truth, whoso wist that you refused to discourse of these light matters for a while, would be apt to suspect that it was but for that you had yourselves erred in like sort. And truly a goodly honour would you confer upon me, obedient as I have ever been to you, if after making me your king and your lawgiver, you were to refuse to discourse of the theme which I prescribe. Away then with the scruple fitter for low minds than yours, and let each study how she may give us a goodly story, and fortune prosper her therein. So spake the king, and the ladies, hearkening, said that even as he would, so it should be. Whereupon he gave all leave to do as they might be severally minded until the supper hour. The sun was still quite high in the heaven, for they had not enlarged in their discourse. Wherefore, Dioneo with the other gallants being set to play at dice, Elisa called the other ladies apart and said, There is a nook hard by this place, where I think none of you has ever been. 'Tis called the Ladies' Vale, whither, ever since we have been here, I have desired to take you, but time meet I have not found until to-day, when the sun is still so high. If then you are minded to visit it, I have no manner of doubt that, when you are there, you will be very glad you came. The ladies answered that they were ready, And so, saying no to the young men, they summoned one of their maids, and set forth. Nor had they gone much more than a mile, when they arrived at the Vale of Ladies. They entered it by a very straight gorge, through which there issued a rivulet, clear as crystal, and a sight than which naught more fair and pleasant, especially at that time when the heat was great, could be imagined, met their eyes. Within the valley, as one of them afterwards told me, was a plain about half a mile in circumference, and so exactly circular that it might have been fashioned according to the compass, though it seemed a work of nature's art, not man's. It was girdled about by 6 hills of no great height, each crowned with a palace that shewed as a goodly little castle. The slopes of the hills were graduated from summit to base after the manner of the successive tiers, ever abridging their circle, that we see in our theatres, and as many as fronted the southern rays were all planted so close with vines, olives, almond trees, cherry trees, fig trees, and other fruit-bearing trees, not a few, that there was not a hand's breadth of vacant space. Those that fronted the north were in like manner covered with copses of oak saplings, ashes, and other trees, as green and straight as might be. Besides which the plain, which was shut in on all sides, save that on which the ladies had entered, was full of firs, cypresses, and bay trees, with here and there a pine, in order and symmetry so meet and excellent, as had they been planted by an artist, the best that might be found in that kind, wherethrough, even when the sun was in the zenith, scarce a ray of light might reach the ground, which was all one lawn of the finest turf, pranked with the hyacinths and divers other flowers. Add to which, nor was there aught there more delightsome, a rivulet, that issuing from one of the gorges between the 2 hills, descended over ledges of living rock, making, as it fell, a murmur most gratifying to the ear, and seen from a distance, shewed as a spray of finest powdered quicksilver, and no sooner reached the little plain than it was gathered into a tiny channel, by which it sped with great velocity to the middle of the plain, where it formed a diminutive lake, like the fish-ponds that townsfolk sometimes make in their gardens, when they have occasion for them. The lake was not so deep, but that a man might stand therein with his breast above the water, and so clear, so pellucid was the water that the bottom, which was of the finest gravel, shewed so distinct, that one, had he wished, who had naught better to do, might have counted the stones. Nor was it only the bottom that was to be seen, but such a multitude of fishes, glancing to and fro, as was at once delight and a marvel to behold. Bank it had none, but its margin was the lawn, to which it imparted a goodlier freshness. So much of the water as it might not contain was received by another tiny channel, through which, issuing from the vale, it glided swiftly to the plain below. To which pleasaunce the damsels being come surveyed it with roving glance, and finding it commendable, and marking the lake in front of them, did, as it was very hot, and they deemed themselves secure from observation, resolve to take a bath. So having bidden their maid wait and keep watch over the access to the vale, and give them warning, if haply any should approach it, they all 7 undressed, and got into the water, which to the whiteness of their flesh was even such a veil as fine glass is to the vermeil of the rose. They being thus in the water, the clearness of which was thereby in no wise affected, did presently begin to go thither and thither after the fish, which had much ado where to bestow themselves, so as to escape out of their hands. In which diversion they spent some time, and caught a few, and then they heaved them out of the water, and dressed them again, and bethinking them that it was time to return to the palace, they began slowly sauntering thither, dilating much as they went upon the beauty of the place, albeit they could not extol it more than they had already done. It was still quite early when they reached the palace, so that they found the gallants yet at play where they had left them. To whom quoth Pomponea with a smile, We have stolen a march upon you to-day. So, replied Dioneo, 'tis with you do first and say after. Ay, my lord, returned Pomponea, and told him at large whence they came, and what the place was like, and how far it was off, and what they had done. What she said of the beauty of the spot begat in the king a desire to see it. Wherefore he straightway ordered supper, whereof, when all had gaily partaken, the three gallants parted from the ladies, and hied them with their servants to the vale, where none of them had ever been before, and having marked all its beauties, extolled it as scarce to be matched in all the world. Then, as the hour was very late, they did but bathe, and as soon as they had resumed their clothes, returned to the ladies, whom they found dancing a carol to an air that Fiammetta sang. Which done, they conversed of the lady's wail, waxing eloquent in praise thereof, insomuch that the king called the seneschal, and bade him have some beds made ready, and carried thither on the morrow, that any that were so minded might there take their siesta. He then had lights and wine and comfits brought, and when they had taken a slight refection, he bade all address them to the dance. So at his behest Pamphilo led a dance, and then the king, turning with gracious mien to Elisa, Fair damsel, quoth he, it was thou to-day didst me this honour of the crown, and it is my will that thine to-night be the honour of the song. Wherefore sing us whatsoever thou hast most lief. That gladly will I, replied Elisa smiling, and thus with dulcet voice began.
If of thy talents, love, be quit I may, I deem it scarce can be, but other fangs I may elude for aye. Service I took with thee, a tender maid, in thy war thinking perfect peace to find, and all my arms upon the ground I laid, yielding myself to thee with trustful mind. Thou, harpy tyrant, whom no faith may bind, eftsoons didst swoop on me, and with thy cruel claws madest me thy prey. Then thy poor captive, bound with many a chain, thou tookest and gavest to him whom fate did call hither my death to be, for that in pain and bitter tears I waste away this thrall. Nor have I ever sigh or tear let fall, so harsh a lord is he that him inclines a jot my grief to allay. My prayers upon the idle air are spent, he hears not, will not hear, wherefore in vain the more each hour my soul doth her torment. Nor may I die, albeit to die were gain. Ah, Lord, have pity of my bitter pain. Help have I none but thee, then take and bind, and at my feet him lay. But if thou wilt not, do my soul but loose from hope, that her still binds with triple chain. Sure, O my Lord, this prayer thou'lt not refuse, the which so thou to grant me do but deign, I look my wonted beauty to regain, and banish misery with those roses white and red, bedecked and gay.
So with a most piteous sigh ended Elisa her song, whereat all wondered exceedingly, nor might any conjecture wherefore she so sang. But the king, who was in a jolly humour, sent for Tindaro, and bade him out with his cornemuse, and caused them tread many a measure thereto, until, no small part of the night being thus spent, he gave leave to all to betake them to rest. End of Conclusion of Day 6.